Once again, hello everyone. My name is Milan Krstic, and I'll be talking today about best practices for using Prisma access security capabilities. Last week, we've talked about adoption of security capabilities available with Prisma Access. We've talked about why they are important, why each capability is important, and how it fits in stopping the overall attack kill chain. And then today we'll be talking about how each of these best practices can be used to its maximum capacity in order to provide all the protection that we need. I'll give a very short introduction, then we'll dig right into the best practices for the security capabilities, and we'll have time for Q&A at the end. Please use the Q&A functionality for this. Okay. As I mentioned, last week we spoke about adopting features, and most of the times adopting features simply gives us some visibility. For example, if you think about antivirus profiles or vulnerability profiles, one might initially configure them in an alert-only mode, which seems like a safe way to start. And that definitely gives us some visibility. But unless we make sure that we're logging everywhere that we can, and that we're actually doing some protection, not just logging, that's just not enough. So simply adoption gives us some visibility. We want to make sure we have maximum visibility, and we want to make sure we have maximum protection. And then have in mind that transitioning from visibility to protection is not trivial. Sometimes it involves risk. It requires some research. It requires changes. So it's not as simple as just simply adopting a feature in alert-only mode, right? In most cases, that's fairly safe, whereas transitioning from visibility to protection might not be that way. And then last but not least, the recommendations we talk about today will apply across the strata, because the feature set is more or less up there. So everything we talk about here most likely can apply to next generation firewalls as well. Starting with antivirus. The antivirus detection supports multiple decoders, and the best practices recommend all except for IMAP and POP3 to be set to reset both. The file types in the Inline ML tab should all be enabled at least in alert mode, and we don't need any packet captures for antivirus. And it's useful to note that the Inline ML tab will override the per protocol Inline ML actions that are configured on the Actions tab. So I'll move into the screenshot right away, and that makes things a little bit more understandable. So if you open the antivirus profile, you will see different protocols that are supported by antivirus. That's basically the rows on the left, and then the columns are signature action, Wildfire action, and Wildfire Inline ML action. The signature action correlates to Wildfire signatures, the ones that are released every 24 hours. The Wildfire signature action correlates with Wildfire signatures that used to be installed every 5 minutes. Now they can be streamed real time. And then finally, inline machine learning action is something very specific. It's not a signature itself. It uses machine learning inline to detect and block unknown threats. The recommendation, as I mentioned, is reset both across the board and across the protocols, except for POP3 and IMAP. The reason why POP3 and IMAP are recommended to be set on alert is because setting them to reset might not provide the best end user experience. And I'll give an example for that. For example, if a user receives a dangerous attachment, a virus through email, which is a common scenario, and they try to fetch this email using IMAP or POP3, the firewalls will block this connection and insert a reset bucket and reset the connection, or maybe even drop it. But from the client point of view, from the end user email client application, this looks like a network issue. So network reset or timeout or drop, it looks like a network issue to the client, and the client will retry to download this infected email again and again and again and again. It might not be clear to the end user what's actually going on. Why is my email not working? They won't be able to get new emails because they'll keep stopping at the same email every time. So this is why the default is slightly safer in terms of user experience alert, if you consider this from a risk assessment-based point of view, this is a risk, right? So if you want to prioritize risk over user experience, you want to use reset both for POP3 and IMAP as well. The Wildfire Inline ML tab has the different machine learning models that can be enabled for Wildfire Inline ML. It's at the moment Windows executables and 2 different sorts of PowerShell scripts. And the recommended setting here would be enable, which inherits the per protocol actions. So that means if we select enable here, then the appropriate action will be taken according to what we configure on the action tab in the 3rd column. Why this is important? It's important because here the different machine learning models can be enabled and disabled per file type, or let's say per ML model type, right? Whereas on the action tab, it's all about protocols and not about the different ML models. This gives some additional flexibility. So the recommendation is enable the models here, and then on the action side, they can either go into alert or, as per practices, reset both for all the protocols except for IMAP and POP3. Moving on to anti-spyware. The anti-spyware is a twofold feature. It's, as we discussed last week, designed to combat command and control. It has 2 different sets of features inside. It's signature policies and DNS policies. Signature policies target the patterns in traffic. And with that, we want critical, high, and medium severity signatures set to reset both action with single packet capture. Informational and low severity signatures should be set with default action with no packet capture. The reason for this is the critical, medium, and high severity signatures are the most important ones. They are the ones that actually target behavior that's known bad, and obviously the severity is the severity of the signature of the event that the signature is matching. And enabling packet capture helps later when trying to troubleshoot or to investigate. Will help security operations and any sort of further investigation on this topic. Information on low severity signatures are usually more for, as the severity says, might be just informational, so nothing actually bad going on. It's just something we might want to report on. And then setting default action will take the default action that is configured for each particular signature individually. So each particular signature has a severity assigned, has a name assigned, has a description assigned, might have a CV number assigned even for in some cases, especially for vulnerabilities, and it will have a default action. And then for information and low, this action might either be alert or might even be silently allowed. So having the default action will make sure we log the things that might be useful, and for other things that should be logged unless specifically needed will not be logged. Moving on to DNS policies. So while signature policies were targeting the patterns and did not depend on particular URLs on domains, the DNS policies target DNS traffic and target DNS domains inside DNS queries. Here we have 2 sources of DNS for bad DNS domains. One is the signatures, and the other one is the DNS security, which is a cloud service with a much wider set of features than the signature-based one. The recommendation is to set both signature and DNS security to sinkhole and to enable single packet capture. We've discussed sinkhole the last time around because sinkhole is something that will give us additional visibility when compared to simply dropping those requests. And single packet capture could help with, again, further investigation because it will save the original packet, the original DNS packet, which might be very useful in follow-up investigations. This is what it looks like in the GUI. So we have signature policies tab where we can simply make 2 rules, one for critical, high, medium, setting them to reset both and having a single packet capture. And then for low and informational, we can use the default action with no packet capture. If we look at DNS, we have signature source path plus content. This is the DNS signatures. The policy action should be sinkhole with single packet capture, and then DNS security has different categories. The recommended action is sinkhole again, together with single packet capture. Moving on to vulnerability protection. Vulnerability protection from configuration point of view is very similar to pattern-based signatures in anti-spyware that we just discussed. So there is a list of different vulnerabilities for which exploitation attempts can be detected. We recommend setting critical, medium, and high severity signatures to reset both with single packet capture enabled, again, for exactly the same reasons as in anti-spyware pattern signatures. And then informational and low severity should be set to default with no packet capture. If we look at the rules, looks very much similar to the anti-spyware. So we can do it with two rules, one with critical high and medium, blocking critical high and medium with reset both and having a single packet capture. And then finally, default low and informational can be set to default action with no packet captures. URL filtering. URL filtering has a list of different URL categories. Some of them are just for information, for categorizing website. Some of them are very, very important as they carry, they potentially can carry lots of different malicious activities. We recommend blocking a list of dangerous categories. So that would be command and control, copyright infringement, dynamic DNS, extremism, malware, phishing, proxy avoidance, anonymizers, unknown, new registered domains, grayware, and parked. I would like to focus on the three categories that are written here in bold. So command and control, malware, and phishing. These three come from Unit 42, come from Wildfire, and are extremely important to be set to block. So these three are really the key and the most important ones to be set to block because they stop actual malware, phishing, and command control. The other categories are not necessarily malicious, but they are either high risk or they've been proven to be used by malware actors historically. So in terms of that, carry a higher risk, and because of that should be blocked. For example, copyright infringement. So maybe some end users might be downloading some unauthorized software copies or maybe movies or something like that. And with that, by using corporate devices and corporate network, they might make the company liable for all of this, which is definitely in no one's best interest. So blocking copyright infringement websites will help mitigate this vulnerability. Dynamic DNS, if you think about dynamic DNS, it's not bad by itself. But if you look at dynamic DNS from corporate point of view, very little business-related websites, if any, will be hosted behind the dynamic DNS domains. And historically, we've seen bad actors use dynamic DNS domains for their malware campaigns. So in terms of that, it's much better from risk point of view to block it than to allow it. Extremism is very similar to copyright infringement, but also extremist websites tend to peddle malware that they use for their activism as well. So that's potentially dangerous. Proxy avoidance and anonymizers. Well, that basically defeats the entire URL filtering feature because the users might just be accessing one website that they use as a proxy or as an anonymizer, and the actual destination might be hidden from everyone. So if someone is using this kind of service, we don't know what they're doing, and hackers can use this to try to mask the actual destination. And then again, in business flows, this should never or almost never be used. Unknown is another high risk category. That means that a PanDB does not know which category the website belongs to. In most cases, it's a fresh new website that we haven't crawled yet and we don't know what it is. But by the virtue of not knowing what it is, it carries a certain risk. And then again, in a risk-aware scenario, you might want to block unknown as a risky category. New registered domain, again, not bad by itself, but we've seen quite a few campaigns using the new registered domains. Very often, the hackers use new registered domains. And in that, they present a much higher risk than a domain that, for example, has been active for more than 90 days, because in those first 90 days, we'll probably see some bad operations happening from that domain. We might mark it as malware or some other category. But when it's just freshly registered, we probably don't know what it is. And there's a possibility that bad actors might be using it. And again, in a business process, you're probably not likely to be using a web application that's just been registered. Grayware is basically what it means. It might not be malware, so it might be some sort of spyware or some unwanted software, but then that's probably not something you want corporate users accessing and downloading, etc. And last but not least, parked. This is most often a domain that has been purchased and not being used, so just showing the default landing page. Or in some cases, this might be domains that were just purchased for type squatting, for example, Google with 3 O's instead of 2, or something similar, where hackers are actually hoping that someone might mistype and land on their website. Most often, people use this just to get clicks and show some banners. But we've definitely seen campaigns where malware actors use these sort of domains to get traffic from the legitimate websites and then move them into phishing or try to serve malware from these kind of websites. Obviously, if the website is parked, there really is no value in accessing it. So even if it's blocked, it shouldn't cause any issues. Right, so these were the categories that are high risk that we recommend being blocked. We recommend setting alert for all other predefined URL categories. The reason for this is visibility. So even if it's not one of these dangerous categories, it's always good to log URL filtering, because then in case of any sort of maybe troubleshooting or security investigation, we will have logs that will show us which URLs were accessed at which time, at which user, and which URL category they belong to. Okay, the second part of URL filtering is the credential theft prevention. This is a very important feature. I'll spend some time talking about that, and it's configured as part of URL filtering. The purpose of credential theft prevention is to prevent users from sending their passwords, their corporate passwords, outside to threat actors. And the recommendation here is to activate credential theft prevention for sensitive categories and alert for all others. We don't have a definition for sensitive categories, but for example, a good example would be the high risk category or one of these categories above. On the other hand, you probably you want to make sure that credential theft prevention is not activated on internal websites or maybe private applications that do use single sign-on and will accept the corporate passwords. In any event, using alert for all the categories will give visibility if users are using their passwords outside of the places where they should, and will enable the security operations to investigate this further. That was what we recommend around categories, but credential theft prevention actually has 3 different modes of operation. I'll spend some time talking about that as well. In the first mode, the credential theft prevention will use user IP mapping and will actually try to detect if the user is trying to send their corporate username out. This mode of operation is fairly simple to implement because it only relies on user to IP mapping. And if we think about mobile users in Prisma Access, we basically have this built in by default because everyone connecting over Polar Protect will already be authenticated, and user ID information will be present for that user. However, this only detects sending of the username. So in terms of that, can cause false positives depending on the username policy that a particular company is using, and doesn't detect the password itself. Another mode is group mapping, where the feature can use all the usernames that the group mapping pulls from the directory used. Again, this might be simple to implement. It only relies on group mapping. However, again, it only looks at usernames and doesn't protect the actual password. So could be prone to false positives, because if the username is first name, not last name, some user might be using that on their Gmail account, right? That's personal, and that's not necessarily the same as the corporate. So it could cause some false positives. The third mode of operation, and the most powerful one, is the main credential filter. The main credential filter actually looks for passwords. And the way it can do that is it requires a user ID agent installed, and it requires a read-only domain controller, and it requires a special domain credential filter application installed on the read-only domain controller together with the user ID agent in order to compile the list of passwords, send them to the firewalls, and make the firewalls able to detect the actual password. So this is the most powerful mode, and this is what we recommend. The reason why it might not be easily used is because it has these requirements. So it requires probably cooperation with the Active Directory team, requires the read-only domain controller, which might not already be there, and requires all these software components to be installed. But definitely, this is the most powerful mode. It detects the actual passwords, which are the crown jewels, and has the least possibility for false positives because it will actually detect the passwords being sent out. Okay, finally, we get to see what that looks like in the GUI. So inside your filtering profile, we have the categories tab. In there, we can configure all the categories to alert, and then the dangerous ones to block. We can also configure the action in case we detect credentials being submitted. And then finally, on user credential detection tab, we can configure the mode of operation for user credential detection. And as I mentioned, domain credential filter is the recommended one. Moving on to file blocking. For file blocking, the recommendation is block risky file types and alert on all others. We have several different risky file types that we recommend being blocked. For example, 7-zip, RAR, CAB, TAR, so these are all archives. Different kinds of scripts, BAT, VB, Windows scripting, WSF, and then executables, class, control panel, exe, DLL, PE, which basically contains exe and DLL, PIF, SCR, which are some older formats, but all executable, OCX as well, and finally JAR, the Java executable archive. Some other risky file types could be torrents, which is more or less dangerous because it might be downloading something we don't know and the user should not be downloading. Then some Microsoft-specific formats like HTN and CHM, which can execute scripts in the background. Flash is probably very safe to be blocked right now because the support for Flash has been pulled for all the present browsers. MSI can contain executables, can be used by malware actors. Help files, again, for Windows. And then last but not the least, multi-level encoding. I just want to spend some time talking about multi-level encoding and why this is important. The firewalls can only go a certain number of levels of encoding down. If we think about it in the simplest possible terms, that could be someone zipping a file over and over again. So zip inside of a zip inside of a zip inside of a zip. The resources are not unlimited, and at a certain point, a limit will be reached. And the question is, what do we do when the limit is reached? Well, this is when this particular file type gets triggered, multi-level encoding. So if we want the connection to be blocked, if the firewall cannot decode files into more levels, then we set the action to block for multi-level encoding. If we just want to alert, then it's alert, and obviously at least alert is recommended, if not blocking. Last but not the least, encrypted file types are recommended to be blocked, so RAR and zip. The reason for this is if the files are encrypted, it means we can't inspect them, Wildfire can't inspect them, so we don't know what's inside. And with that, they're risky. And also we've seen malware actors use them. So they might send two emails, one with the RAR, another with the password or with the zip. And this is something that there is no way to inspect because the encryption is protecting them. Having in mind, we're here recommending to block a lot of possibly common file types like PE or maybe MSI. It's useful to think about this in the context of where you want to apply these sort of rules. If a particular company allows their users to download files from the internet, so PE and install applications on end user computers, then blocking these executables could block a lot of things. For example, with blocking PE, we could block Windows Update, right? And that's probably not something we want to do. So in terms of that, you need to be careful when thinking about when to use file blocking and how exactly to use it. Some of these file types are fairly easy. For example, scripts, batch scripts, VB, it's probably something that users would never download. But then archives or executables, that really depends on the specific use case. So I would say that it's very important always to think about use case when using file blocking. For example, email. In email, there should never be scripts, there should never be executables. If there's an executable in email, there's a 9 out of 10 chance, or even higher, that that's a bad executable, and that's something that shouldn't be there. So always keep in mind about the context when using a file blocking. It's a very powerful feature. It's able to reduce the attack surface quite a bit, but because of that, it can also block a lot of unintended files. So always keep in mind always keep that in mind when thinking about how to apply file blocking. So this is what it looks like in the GUI. We can just add the risky file types in one rule, block them in both directions, so upload and download, and set the action to block. The other ones, we want to block encrypted ones, and then for all other, we want to set this to alert for visibility purposes. Again, very useful in case of either troubleshooting or security investigations. When it comes to Wildfire, it's pretty simple. The Wildfire profile itself is very simple. The recommendation is for all applications and all file types in all the directions, upload to public cloud. The reason for this is you always want to have maximum protection. Every file that the firewall can detect where a Wildfire profile is attached, it will check if it's a known or an unknown file. If it's an unknown file, it will send it to Wildfire Cloud for further analysis. And then Wildfire can provide all sorts of protections based on this. So it looks very simple rule, forward everything, all the applications, all file types in both directions to the public cloud. In case there are some specific regulatory requirements, it's possible to exclude some files, but it's definitely recommended to forward everything that can be forwarded into Wildfire for analysis. Okay, that's everything I